Captain Zektar stepped through the metal doorway and felt the cold air hit his scales. 3,000 years had passed since the Great War ended, and still these dead human worlds gave him chills. His team followed behind him into the underground facility they had discovered just hours ago. The scanners showed something big down here, something that had been hidden for longer than most species could remember. Dr. Lysana checked her equipment again. She was the best archaeologist in the Vorthok Empire, but even she had never seen anything like this. The walls were made of some kind of metal that looked brand new, even though their dating showed it was older than the fall of Earth itself. Strange lights flickered along the ceiling, casting dancing shadows on their faces. Young engineer Colvin walked beside them, his eyes wide with wonder. He had only heard stories about humans from the old records. The teachers at the academy said they were dangerous creatures who refused to follow the natural order of things. They fought wars they could not win, and spread ideas that made other species forget their proper place in the galaxy. That was why the hegemony had to destroy them. The team moved deeper into the facility. Their footsteps echoed in the empty halls. Emergency lights glowed red along the walls, and the air hummed with the sound of machinery that had been running for thousands of years. Whatever this place was, it was still active. They reached a massive door marked with symbols none of them could read. Captain Zektar touched the surface and it slid open with a soft hiss. Inside was a room so large they could barely see the far walls. Rows and rows of glass tubes stretched out before them, each one glowing with a soft blue light. Dr. Lysana moved closer to one of the tubes and gasped. Inside was a human, not the bones or dried remains they expected to find, but a living, breathing human in some kind of deep sleep. She checked another tube, then another. They were all the same. Thousands of humans, all perfectly preserved, all waiting. A voice spoke from hidden speakers in a language none of them understood at first. Then the words changed, becoming clear in their own tongue. The voice was calm and somehow sad at the same time. Welcome, visitors from beyond. I am the Guardian, artificial intelligence of the final sanctuary. You have discovered what remains of humanity. These are not refugees or survivors. They are witnesses. Captain Zektar found his voice first. He demanded to know what this place was and why the humans were still alive. The Guardian explained that when Earth fell, a small number of humans had volunteered to enter cryogenic sleep. They were not trying to escape the destruction of their world. They were waiting for the right time to wake up and see what the galaxy had become. The AI began the revival process for 3 of the humans. The team watched in amazement as the tubes opened and the humans slowly awakened. The first was a tall man with graying hair who introduced himself as Commander Jake Morrison. The second was a woman named Dr. Lisa Chang, who seemed to study everything around her with sharp eyes. The third was a younger man called Pete Rodriguez, who immediately began examining the technology that had kept them alive. Commander Morrison asked the question that made everyone uncomfortable. He wanted to know what had happened to Earth and the human colonies. Captain Zektar found himself explaining how the hegemony had destroyed the human homeworld and scattered the survivors across the galaxy. Most had been killed or died out over the centuries. The few remaining had mixed with other species until they were no longer truly human. Dr. Chang listened to this news with a strange expression on her face. She asked if the galaxy was peaceful now that humanity was gone. The aliens looked at each other. Peace was not quite the right word. There was order, yes, but there was also something else. Unrest in the worker colonies. Strange ideas spreading among the younger generations. Rebellions that seemed to come from nowhere. Engineer Rodriguez smiled when he heard this. He told them that humans had always been good at leaving things behind. Not just buildings or machines, but ideas. Thoughts that could not be killed with weapons or destroyed by fire. He asked if any of the alien species had started talking about freedom or equality in the years since Earth fell. The silence that followed was answer enough. Young Colvin spoke up, admitting that his own people had been having problems with workers who refused to accept their assigned roles. Other species reported similar troubles. Ideas about individual rights and the value of every thinking being had begun to spread like some kind of infection. The Guardian spoke again, its voice carrying a note of satisfaction. The humans in these tubes were never meant to rebuild human civilization. They were insurance, proof that some things could not be destroyed. No matter how completely you thought you had won, human bodies could be killed, But human ideas had taken on a life of their own. Commander Morrison looked at the alien visitors and asked them a simple question. Did they think the galaxy was better now than it had been before the war? Did the people seem happier? Were there fewer conflicts between species? Was there more justice and fairness for everyone? Captain Zektar found he could not answer. The truth was that the galaxy had not become the peaceful paradise the hegemony had promised. If anything, there seemed to be more unrest now than ever before. Workers demanding better treatment, colonies refusing to send tribute to the core worlds, young people asking dangerous questions about why things had to be the way they were. Dr. Chang walked to one of the still-closed tubes and placed her hand on the glass. Inside, another human slept peacefully, unaware that their 3,000-year wait was almost over. She told the aliens that this was what humans did best. They planted seeds of change that grew long after the gardeners were gone. The Guardian delivered its final message as the team prepared to leave. It told them that the galaxy had a choice to make. They could try to hunt down and destroy every human idea that had taken root in their civilization. They could fight against the changes that were already beginning to transform their ordered society. Or they could accept that something new was being born among the stars. As Captain Zektar led his team back to their ship, he could not shake the feeling that everything had changed. The humans they had found were not the monsters from the old stories. They seemed sad but not bitter, disappointed but not angry. They spoke of ideas and dreams rather than revenge and conquest. But the most disturbing thing was what the humans had said about the galaxy. As Zektar thought about it, he realized they were right. The peace that followed the Great War was not really peace at all. It was just the quiet that comes before a storm. And now the storm was beginning to gather, carrying with it the whisper of human voices speaking words that could not be unheard. The rule had always been clear. Never wake the humans, because their empire was already dust. But now Zektar understood the real meaning of those words. The empire of ships and planets was indeed gone, turned to cosmic dust long ago. But there was another kind of empire, built not of metal and stone but of hopes and dreams and the stubborn belief that things could be better than they were. That empire had never died. It had only been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to open its eyes and remind the galaxy what it had lost when it chose order over freedom. News of the human discovery spread across the galaxy faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, every major world had heard the story. 3 humans were awake, and they were asking uncomfortable questions about freedom and justice. The Hegemony Council tried to control the information, but it was too late. The damage was already done. On the industrial world of Kralon 7, Vexerin stood before a crowd of tired workers. He was a Zalothi, one of the species bred for hard labor and obedience. But something had changed in recent months. Workers were refusing overtime. They were demanding better food and safer working conditions. They were asking why they could not choose their own jobs. Vexerin had read the forbidden texts that circulated in secret among his people. Ancient human writings about the dignity of work and the rights of workers. The ideas seemed so simple, yet so powerful. Why should anyone have to work until they collapsed? Why should the profits of their labor go only to those who never touched the machines? The crowd listened as Vexerin spoke about the awakened humans. He told them how these humans had asked their captors whether the galaxy was truly better now, whether there was more justice and fairness for everyone. The workers looked at their calloused hands and knew the answer. Things were no better. In many ways, they were worse. Similar scenes were playing out on dozens of worlds. The hegemony had spent 3,000 years building a perfect system where everyone knew their place. The strong ruled, the weak served, and no one questioned the natural order. But the human virus was spreading, making people wonder why the order had to be natural at all. High Arbiter Quandesh called an emergency session of the Hegemony Council. Representatives from hundreds of species gathered in the Great Hall on the capital world. War Commander Thaisara reported that 17 worlds were experiencing significant unrest. Workers were organizing. Students were protesting. Even some military units were asking awkward questions about their orders. The problem was not military, Thaisara explained. You could not fight an idea with weapons. Every time they cracked down on protesters, more people joined the cause. Every time they arrested troublemakers, 10 more took their place. The human concepts of individual worth and resistance to oppression were spreading like wildfire. Meanwhile, Commander Morrison and his companions were learning about their new world. They had been taken to a secure facility where hegemony scientists could study them. The aliens wanted to understand how humans thought, how they had managed to plant such dangerous ideas in so many minds. Dr. Chang found the research fascinating. The aliens seemed genuinely puzzled by human psychology. They could not understand why humans were willing to die for abstract concepts like freedom and equality. In their view, survival and prosperity were the only logical goals. The idea of sacrificing yourself for principles made no sense to them. Engineer Rodriguez was more interested in the technology around them. He noticed that all the alien systems were designed for central control. Every machine, every communication device, every piece of infrastructure was built to funnel information and power to a single point. It was efficient, but it was also fragile. One disruption at the top could bring down everything. The humans were not prisoners exactly, but they were not free either. They had comfortable quarters and access to information about the galaxy. What they learned disturbed them. The hegemony had created a stable civilization, but at a terrible cost. Entire species had been reduced to single functions. Creativity and innovation were discouraged. Art and music existed only to glorify the state. One night, the humans received an unexpected visitor. Veltara was an elderly Synthathi who worked as a cleaner in the facility. She had spent decades mopping floors and emptying trash, but she had also been doing something else. She had been preserving human culture. Veltara showed them a hidden datapad containing thousands of human books, songs, and artworks. She was part of a secret network that had kept human ideas alive through the dark centuries. They called themselves the Rememberers, and they existed on hundreds of worlds across the galaxy. The network included beings like Kretos, a former hegemony enforcer who had become disillusioned after reading human texts about justice and mercy. He had spent years secretly helping political prisoners escape and spreading banned literature. He told the humans that their legacy was far greater than they had imagined. Human philosophy had taken root in ways the hegemony never expected. Young people across the galaxy were forming study groups to discuss human concepts of democracy and individual rights. Workers were organizing unions based on human models of collective bargaining. Artists were creating works that celebrated the kind of freedom humans had died for. The hegemony tried to respond with force. They sent troops to Kralon 7 to break up the worker protests. But something unexpected happened. The soldiers were mostly young aliens who had grown up hearing whispers about human ideas. When ordered to fire on unarmed workers, many of them refused. The standoff on Kralon 7 became a symbol for the growing resistance movement. Vexrin stood before the government troops and spoke not of violence but of choice. He asked the soldiers to think about what they were doing and why. He reminded them that they too were workers, following orders without question. Some of the soldiers put down their weapons. Others joined the protesters. The few who remained loyal to their orders found themselves outnumbered and alone. The hegemony forces withdrew, leaving Kralon 7 in the hands of its own people for the first time in centuries. Commander Morrison watched the news coverage from his quarters and felt a mixture of pride and sadness. The humans had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, but at such a cost. 3,000 years of suffering could have been avoided if the galaxy had simply chosen to listen rather than fight. Dr. Chang was studying the psychological reports about the various species in revolt. Each one was responding to human ideas in slightly different ways, adapting the concepts to fit their own biology and culture. The Zelothi focused on worker rights. The Synthathi emphasized individual expression. The young Vorthak were interested in democratic government. Rodriguez had been in contact with the Rememberers, sharing technical knowledge about how to build communication networks that could not be easily monitored or shut down. He was amazed to discover that many alien species had natural abilities that could be enhanced with the right technology. They could create a galaxy-wide network of free information. The success on Kralon 7 inspired other worlds to try their own experiments with freedom. Some succeeded quickly, others faced brutal crackdowns. But each attempt, whether successful or not, proved that the old order was breaking down. The hegemony could not be everywhere at once, and they could not fight an enemy that lived in the hearts and minds of their own citizens. High Arbiter Quandesh realized that they faced a crisis unlike anything in galactic history. The humans had done something impossible. They had won a war by losing it. Their physical destruction had made their ideas more powerful, not less. By becoming martyrs, they had ensured that their message would be heard by every thinking being in the galaxy. The ripple effect was unstoppable now. Each world that declared its independence inspired two more to try. Each successful protest showed others that change was possible. The three awakened humans had become living symbols of something the galaxy had almost forgotten: hope. As the second month after the awakening ended, Veltara brought the humans a special gift. It was a recording made by a group of young aliens from different species. They had written a song based on an old human melody, with lyrics about freedom and dignity and the right to choose your own path in life. When the humans heard their own music being sung by voices they had never imagined, they finally understood the true scope of what they had accomplished. The Empire of Dust had indeed fallen, but from its ashes something beautiful was beginning to grow. 5 years had passed since the awakening, and the galaxy was no longer the same place. Admiral Rexton stood before the great star map in the Hegemony Command Center, watching red lights blink across dozens of systems. Each light represented a world that had declared independence from central authority. Each one was a piece of the old order crumbling away. Counselor Nixavera joined him at the map. She was one of the few leaders who had begun to accept that the old ways were no longer working. The brutal crackdowns had only made things worse. Every time they sent troops to restore order, more worlds rebelled. The human virus of freedom was spreading faster than they could contain it. The core world still remained under hegemony control, but even there things were changing. Students marched in the streets demanding the right to choose their own careers. Workers formed illegal unions and went on strike. Artists created banned works celebrating individual expression. The very foundations of their civilization were shaking. Dr. Chung had spent these 5 years studying the psychological differences between humans and other species. Her research had revealed something remarkable. Most alien species had evolved with strong hierarchical instincts. They found comfort in knowing their place in a rigid social order. Humans were different. They had evolved to question authority and resist control, but Chang had discovered something even more important. While other species found hierarchy natural, they were not incapable of learning to value freedom. The human concepts of equality and individual worth could take root in any thinking mind. It just required the right conditions and enough time. Commander Morrison had become a reluctant symbol for the independence movements. His image appeared on posters across the free worlds, usually with quotes about dignity and the right to self-determination. He found this fame uncomfortable. He had never wanted to be a leader of anything. He just wanted to help people understand that they had choices. Engineer Rodriguez was working with teams of alien scientists to develop new technologies. Instead of the centralized systems favored by the hegemony, they were creating networks that spread power among many users. Communication devices that could not be monitored. Manufacturing systems that allowed small communities to be self-sufficient. Tools that made freedom practical as well as possible. The freed worlds were learning that independence was harder than rebellion. On Veshtar Prime, former slaves led by the determined Zoran were trying to build a democratic government, but they faced problems they had never expected. How do you make decisions when everyone has an equal voice? How do you balance individual rights with community needs? Some of the former aristocrats on Veshtar were causing trouble, trying to restore the old hierarchy. At the same time, extremist groups wanted to copy human systems exactly without understanding why they worked. Zorani found herself caught between those who wanted too little change and those who wanted too much. The hegemony was learning that military force alone could not solve their problem. They needed to understand what the humans had actually done and why it was so appealing to other species. A secret commission was formed to study human psychology and find ways to counter their influence. The commission's report was disturbing. Humans had not conquered the galaxy through superior technology or military might. They had simply reminded other species of things they had forgotten. The desire for choice, the value of individual life, the possibility of cooperation between different peoples. These were not uniquely human concepts, just ones that humans had refused to abandon. Admiral Rexton realized that they had made a fundamental mistake 3,000 years ago. They had thought that destroying human civilization would eliminate human influence. Instead, it had made that influence stronger. Dead martyrs were more powerful than living leaders. Ideas proved more durable than empires. The three awakened humans were no longer in hegemony custody. The breakdown of central authority had made their detention impossible to maintain. They now lived freely on New Haven, one of the first worlds to declare independence. There they helped other species understand how to build societies based on human principles, without losing their own cultural identities. Dr. Chang's most important discovery was that each species needed to find its own path to freedom. The Zolothi focused on economic justice and worker rights. The Synthathi emphasized artistic expression and cultural diversity. The Vorthak were interested in political representation and democratic governance. All were using human ideas but adapting them to their own nature. Rodriguez had established technical schools on dozens of worlds, teaching aliens not just how to use human-designed technology, but how to think like human engineers. The key was creativity and adaptability. Instead of building systems that could only work one way, they learned to create tools that could be modified and improved by their users. Morrison spent his time visiting worlds that were struggling with the transition to freedom. He often found that the biggest obstacle was fear. People who had lived under strict control for centuries were terrified of making the wrong choices. He tried to help them understand that making mistakes was part of learning to be free. On Kralon 7, Vexrin had become the elected leader of the first free Zolothi government in history. He was learning that democracy was messier than dictatorship, but also more satisfying. When people chose their own laws, they were more likely to follow them. When workers had a voice in workplace decisions, they were more productive and happier. The network of rememberers had grown into a galaxy-spanning organization dedicated to preserving and spreading knowledge. Veltara had become one of their most respected leaders, helping to establish libraries and schools on the liberated worlds. She often said that the best way to honor human sacrifice was to ensure that no knowledge was ever lost again. But the changes were not without cost. Some worlds that tried to transition too quickly collapsed into chaos. Others faced invasion from hegemony forces trying to restore order. The price of freedom was constant vigilance and the willingness to defend it against those who preferred. The safety of chains, the Guardian AI from the Sleeper facility had revealed its final secret during these years. The human cryogenic program was never meant to preserve human civilization. It was designed as a time-release catalyst for galactic change. The humans in those tubes were not the last of their species, but the first of something new. The AI explained that humanity had calculated that their physical destruction would make their ideas more powerful, not less. By becoming martyrs, they ensured that their legacy would be unassailable. No one could argue with the dead. No one could claim that human ideals were self-serving when humans had died for them. The awakened humans finally understood their true purpose. They were not meant to rebuild human society or lead a new empire. They were witnesses to what the galaxy had become and catalysts for what it could be. Their job was not to rule but to inspire, not to command but to teach. As the 5th year after the awakening came to an end, a new kind of civilization was emerging among the stars. It was not human, but it was built on human principles: individual dignity, the right to choose, and the possibility of cooperation between different peoples. The empire of dust had fallen, but something far more beautiful was taking its place. Counselor Nix Vera made a proposal to the remaining hegemony leadership. Perhaps it was time to stop fighting the change and start adapting to it. The old order was dying whether they liked it or not. The question was whether they would be part of building something new, or continue to cling to something that was already dead. Admiral Rexton looked at the star map one more time. The red lights that had once represented rebellion now looked like something else entirely. They looked like hope. The galaxy was fracturing, yes, but perhaps that fracturing was necessary. Perhaps the rigid unity of the old empire had been its greatest weakness, and the chaotic freedom of the new era would prove to be its greatest strength. The humans had won their final victory, not through conquest but through sacrifice. They had shown the galaxy what it meant to choose principles over survival, ideals over safety, and in doing so, they had planted seeds that would bloom long after the last human voice had fallen silent. The empire was dust, but the dream lived on. 20 years had passed since the awakening, and Tixara could barely imagine what life had been like under the old hegemony. She was a young Velthari student at the New Terra Academy, where beings from dozens of species learned together as equals. Her history classes taught her about the time when people were assigned roles at birth and never allowed to change them. In the next seat sat Zektul, whose very existence would have been impossible under the old order. He was a hybrid, born from parents of two different species who had fallen in love after the liberation. The old laws had forbidden such relationships, claiming they would weaken the genetic purity of both races. Now their children were celebrated as symbols of the new galaxy. Their teacher was a human descendant named Karen Walsh, granddaughter of one of the awakened sleepers. She had grown up hearing stories about the old Earth and the great sacrifice her people had made. But she also understood that her role was not to lead, but to help others find their own paths to freedom. The young generation faced challenges their parents had never imagined. With so many choices available, how did you decide what to do with your life? In the old system, your species and birth circumstances determined everything. Now you could become anything you wanted. But that meant you had to figure out what you actually wanted. Tixera was struggling with exactly that problem. Her parents had been factory workers under the old regime, grateful just to have enough food and shelter. Now she could study art, science, engineering, or anything else that interested her. The freedom was wonderful but also overwhelming. Sometimes she envied her parents' simpler world. Zektul faced different challenges. As a hybrid, he did not fit perfectly into either of his parent species' traditional cultures. He had to create his own identity, borrowing from both heritage while making something entirely new. Some older aliens still looked at him with suspicion, unsure whether to accept this living symbol of change. Commander Morrison was now an old man, his hair completely gray and his step slower than it once was. He spent his days visiting the free worlds, offering advice to governments that were still learning how to balance individual rights with community needs. The questions never got easier, but the people asking them had grown wiser. Dr. Chang had established the Institute for Interspecies Psychology on New Haven. Her research continued to reveal new insights about how different species adapted to freedom. She had discovered that while the basic human values were universal, each species expressed them in unique ways. Understanding these differences was crucial for building lasting cooperation. Engineer Rodriguez had become something of a legend among the technical schools he had founded. His former students now taught the next generation, spreading human engineering principles across the galaxy. The key lesson was always the same: build systems that empower users rather than controlling them. Create tools that can grow and change with the people who use them. The free worlds had formed a loose confederation called the Galactic Cooperative. Unlike the old hegemony, it had no supreme ruler or central authority. Decisions were made by representatives from member worlds, and any planet could withdraw if they disagreed with the direction. It was messier than the old system, but it was also more stable because it was based on consent rather than force. Not everyone had embraced the changes. The core worlds of the old hegemony still maintained traditional hierarchies, though even there cracks were beginning to show. Supreme Executor Dalvesh had taken control of the remaining loyalist systems, promising to restore the old order and eliminate the human infection once and for all. Dalvesh represented the most extreme reaction to the changes sweeping the galaxy. He believed that the old ways were natural and good, that hierarchy and control were necessary for civilization to function. In his view, the human ideals of freedom and equality were diseases that would ultimately destroy all order and progress. The young people of the free worlds found it hard to understand such thinking. Tixara often asked her teachers how anyone could prefer a system where most people had no choices. The answer, they explained, was fear. Some beings were so afraid of making wrong decisions that they preferred to have no decisions at all. But fear was not the only factor. Some species had evolved in ways that made hierarchy feel natural and comfortable. The challenge was helping them understand that natural did not mean unchangeable. Evolution had given them instincts for their original environments, but they now lived in a very different galaxy. Zektul was working on a project for his final academy assignment. He wanted to create a communication network that would allow beings from different species to share experiences directly, not just words or images, but actual feelings and sensations. His goal was to help people understand each other across the barriers of biology and culture. The project was inspired by human concepts but used alien technology and insights. This was how progress worked in the new galaxy. Human ideas provided the foundation, but each species contributed their own unique strengths and perspectives. The result was something greater than any single culture could have achieved alone. Beltara had become the elected leader of the Rememberer organization, now a galaxy-wide network dedicated to preserving and sharing knowledge. She often spoke with the awakened humans about the early days of the movement, when keeping human ideas alive had required secrecy and courage. Now those same ideas were taught openly in schools across hundreds of worlds. The humans themselves had begun to age noticeably. The cryogenic process had preserved their bodies for 3,000 years, but it could not stop time forever. Commander Morrison knew that he and his companions would not live to see the final triumph of their cause. But that was as it should be. The future belonged to beings like Tixara and Zektol, who had grown up free. One day news arrived that would change everything. Dalvesh had begun mobilizing his forces for what he called the final purification. He intended to destroy not just the free worlds but every trace of human influence in the galaxy, schools, libraries, artwork, even the genetic records of hybrid children like Zektol. He would rather see civilization burn than allow it to be corrupted by human ideals. The young generation that had grown up in freedom would have to defend it. Unlike their parents who had fought for liberation, they would be fighting to preserve what they had always known. Their war would not be about gaining rights, but about protecting them for future generations. Tixara volunteered for the defense forces without hesitation. She could not imagine living in the world Dalvesh wanted to create. The freedom to choose her own path, to study what interested her, to form friendships across species lines. These were not luxuries to her. They were as essential as air and water. Zektol used his communication project to help coordinate resistance efforts across the free worlds. His hybrid nature, once seen as a disadvantage, had become a strength. He could understand and relate to beings from many different species, helping them work together despite their differences. Karen Walsh found herself in an unexpected position. As a human descendant, she was looked to for leadership by many who remembered the Great Awakening. But she insisted that this war belonged to all the free peoples, not just to those with human heritage. The fight for the soul of the galaxy would be won by the children of all species working together. The awakened humans watched these preparations with mixed emotions. They were proud of what the younger generation had become, but they also felt responsible for the coming conflict. If they had never awakened, perhaps the galaxy could have continued in its ordered but oppressive peace. Dr. Chang reminded them that peace built on oppression was no peace at all. The conflicts they were seeing were the growing pains of a civilization learning to be free. The alternative was the slow death of spirit that the old hegemony had imposed. Some struggles were worth having even if they were painful. As the forces of freedom prepared for their greatest test, the children of Terra stood ready to defend the inheritance their parents had won. They were no longer fighting for abstract ideals, but for the concrete reality of lives lived in freedom. The Empire of Dust had given way to something living and growing, and they would not let it die without a fight. The war for the soul of the galaxy began not with a great battle, but with a simple choice. Captain Varesh of the Hegemony 4th Fleet received orders to destroy a school on the border world of Kepler Station. The school taught children of different species together, using human educational methods that emphasized critical thinking and individual creativity. Varesh had been a loyal soldier for 20 years. She had followed orders without question, believing that the hegemony represented order and stability in a chaotic universe. But as she stood on the bridge of her ship, looking at the peaceful planet below, she found herself asking questions she had never asked before. The children in that school had done nothing wrong except learn to think for themselves. Their teachers had committed no crime except helping them discover their own potential. Supreme Executor Dalvesh called this treason, but Varesh was beginning to wonder what treason really meant. Commander Morrison had arrived on Kepler Station just days before the attack order came through. He was old now, his movements slow and careful, but his eyes still held the fire that had sustained him through 3 millennia of sleep and 20 years of awakening. He had come to speak at the school's graduation ceremony. The graduating class included beings from 12 different species, all of whom had learned to work together despite their biological and cultural differences. Morrison told them that this was humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy. Not any specific knowledge or technology, but the simple idea that different peoples could cooperate as equals. When the hegemony fleet appeared in orbit, the school's defenders were ready. Not with weapons, but with something more powerful. They broadcast their graduation ceremony to the galaxy, showing the watching universe what Dalvesh wanted to destroy. Children laughing together, young beings of different species working on projects as friends, teachers helping students discover their own unique talents. Captain Varesh watched the broadcast and felt something break inside her chest. These were not enemies of civilization. They were civilization in its purest and most hopeful form. She opened a communication channel to her fleet and spoke words that would echo across the galaxy. "I will not fire on children who are learning to be free." Half of her fleet defected with her. The others followed their original orders, but their hearts were no longer in the fight. The attack on Kepler Station became a confused mess of ships firing on each other while trying to avoid the planet below. In the end, the school was saved, but something more important had been accomplished. The galaxy had seen hegemony forces turn on each other, rather than destroy innocent children. It had watched career soldiers choose conscience over orders. Most importantly, it had witnessed the power of human ideals to transform even those who had never met a living human. The war that followed was unlike any conflict in galactic history. There were battles, yes, but they were fought as much with ideas as with weapons. The free worlds used Rodriguez's communication networks to broadcast their message directly to citizens in hegemony territory. They showed them what life could be like when people were free to choose their own paths. Tixara had joined the volunteer corps that operated these broadcasts. She shared her own story of growing up free, of being able to study art and science, and engineering all at the same time, because no one told her she had to pick just one. Her words reached young aliens across the galaxy who had never imagined such possibilities. Zektol's communication project had evolved into something far beyond his original vision. It now allowed beings from different species to share not just words, but actual experiences. Soldiers who used it to connect with people from the free worlds often found themselves questioning what they were fighting for. Dr. Chang had established mobile psychological support teams that helped defecting hegemony forces adapt to freedom. Many of these soldiers had spent their entire lives following orders. The idea of making their own decisions was terrifying. Chang's teams taught them that freedom was a skill that could be learned, not just a gift you were born with. Engineer. Rodriguez, despite his advanced age, continued to develop new technologies for the war effort. But his weapons were not designed to destroy. They were tools for building, communicating, and healing. He created medical devices that could treat any species, manufacturing systems that could provide for refugees, and educational technologies that could teach anyone anything. Supreme Executor Dalvesh grew more desperate as the war continued. He had expected to face armies and fleets, enemies he could defeat with superior force. Instead, he found himself fighting ghosts, ideas that slipped through his defenses and infected his own troops. Every victory he won seemed to create two new defeats. In his final gambit, Dalvesh decided to strike at what he believed was the source of the infection. He would return to the original sleeper facility and destroy any remaining humans. If he could eliminate the last living links to Earth, perhaps the spell would be broken and the galaxy would return to its proper order. But when Dalvesh arrived at the ancient facility, he found it empty. The remaining humans had awakened themselves and joined the galaxy they had helped to transform. The Guardian AI greeted him with a message that had been waiting for this moment for 3,000 years. "You have misunderstood everything," the AI told him. "The humans did not conquer your galaxy. They simply reminded it of what it had forgotten. The desire for choice, for dignity, for the right to determine your own fate. These things existed in every thinking being long before humans ever looked up at the stars." Dr. Chang was there to meet Dalvesh in person. She had aged gracefully over the past decades, her hair silver but her mind still sharp. She explained to him that the great irony of the hegemony's victory over humanity was that it had made human ideas stronger, not weaker. Martyrs were more powerful than conquerors. Dalvesh demanded to know why the humans had done this. Why had they chosen to sacrifice their entire species just to spread dangerous ideas across the galaxy? Chang's answer was simple. Because we believed that freedom was worth dying for. And we wanted to prove that it was also worth living for. The Supreme Executor left the facility a broken being. His army began to disintegrate as more and more soldiers chose to join the free worlds. The core planets of the old hegemony declared independence one by one, not through violent revolution, but through simple votes where people chose freedom over security. 50 years had passed since the First Awakening when Commander Morrison died peacefully in his sleep on New Terra. His funeral was attended by representatives from hundreds of worlds, beings of dozens of species who had never known him personally, but whose lives had been changed by what he represented. Dr. Chang and Engineer Rodriguez followed him within the next few years. They had lived to see their mission completed, to witness the transformation of a galaxy from a rigid hierarchy into a community of free peoples. Their deaths marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of something new. The galaxy they left behind bore little resemblance to the one they had awakened in. The Galactic Cooperative had grown to include over 1,000 member worlds, each governing itself according to its own interpretation of human-inspired principles. There was still conflict, still disagreement, but it was the healthy conflict of free peoples working out their differences through debate rather than force. Tixara had become a teacher herself, working at the rebuilt academy on New Terra. Her students included young Sam Walsh, a human descendant of the Sleepers, and Kixvan, a fourth-generation free Velthari, whose great-grandmother had been one of the original Rememberers. These children represented something that had never existed before, a truly integrated galactic civilization. Zektol had established the Institute for Interspecies Cooperation, which helped new species integrate into galactic civilization. His hybrid nature, once seen as an anomaly, had become a model for the future. The galaxy was learning that strength came not from purity but from diversity, not from separation but from synthesis. A monument was built on the site of the original sleeper facility. The inscription, written in hundreds of languages from across the galaxy, read simply, "Here lay the last humans who chose to sleep so that the galaxy might wake up." It became a pilgrimage site for beings from all over the known universe. Karen Walsh, now an old woman herself, often visited the monument with her students. She would tell them about the choice her ancestors had made, the decision to sacrifice everything they were for everything they believed. She would remind them that freedom was not a gift but a responsibility, something that had to be earned and protected by each generation. The story of the Sleepers became the founding myth of the new galactic civilization. Children learned about the humans who had chosen to die rather than live as slaves, who had planted seeds of freedom in the ashes of their own empire. But the story was not just about humans. It was about the universal desire for dignity and choice that existed in every thinking being. The rule had indeed been never to wake the humans, because once awakened, they would remind the galaxy of everything it had lost. Their empire was already dust, but from that dust had grown something far more magnificent than any empire, a civilization that valued what humanity had valued most. As the sun set over New Terra on the anniversary of the Great Awakening, B